The glass walls of the H-Tech Command Center in Seoul didn't just overlook the Han River. They overlooked a digital empire that spanned 6 continents. But tonight, the empire was hemorrhaging. Park Hyun-Jae stood at the center of the chaos, a 65-year-old monolith in a bespoke charcoal suit. Around him, the air hummed with the frantic clicking of mechanical keyboards and the low, panicked murmurs of the world's most expensive cybersecurity consultants. Red light pulsed from the overhead monitors, bathing Hyun-Jae's sharp, weathered features in the color of a sunset. "Status," Hyun-Jae said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a blade. "It's a recursive logic bomb, Chairman," a technician stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. It's eating the infrastructure from the inside. We've tried the white hat protocols. We've tried the Swiss isolation. The code adapts faster than we can isolate it. If we don't stop the loop in 3 hours, the global grid goes dark. H-Tech loses $1 trillion in valuation by morning." Hyun-Jae didn't flinch. He looked at the scrolling green lines on the main screen, a waterfall of digital destruction. He was the most powerful man in the country, perhaps the world, yet he felt a cold, familiar hollowness. He had sacrificed everything for this grid. He had pruned his life of distractions, of love, of a wife he once adored, to ensure this machine never stopped. "Fix it," he whispered, "or don't bother coming in tomorrow. None of you." He turned his back on them, staring out at the city. He was a man who owned the world, but had no one to call to tell him the news. 7,000 miles away, Virginia, USA. The morning sun filtered through the sheer linen curtains of a craftsman-style home that smelled of jasmine tea and old books. Tasha Henry, 65, sat on her porch, her posture as regal as a queen in exile. Her hair was a striking silver strand sophisticated crown. She didn't look like a woman who had been discarded. She looked like a woman who had built her own universe from the ashes of a heartbreak. She sipped her tea, watching a blue jay on the feeder. 10 years ago, she had been mocked. A 55-year-old divorcee, pregnant and abandoned by a billionaire. They thought she would break. They didn't know that Tasha Henry thrived in the quiet. "Mom?" The screen door creaked open. Silas, 10 years old, stepped out. He was dressed in a simple hoodie, but his eyes, dark, piercing, and terrifyingly intelligent, were a mirror image of the man in the Seoul penthouse. He wasn't holding a toy. He was holding a sleek, custom-built laptop. "The H-Tech servers are screaming," Silas said casually, sitting on the steps near her feet. Tasha stilled. The name H-Tech still carried a ghost of a sting. "Are they? I thought their security was impenetrable." "It is for humans," Silas muttered, his fingers already dancing across the keys. "But someone sent a recursive parasite into their core. It's a beautiful piece of math, actually. It's using a 128-bit loop to mimic the host's heartbeat." Tasha looked down at her son. He saw the world in patterns, in strings of logic that bypassed the messiness of human emotion. He was the miracle she had raised in secret, the genius who had never known a father's name, only a mother's strength. "Can you see the solution?" she asked softly. Silas tilted his head, a small, confident smirk playing on his lips, the exact same smirk Hyun-Jae wore when he closed a deal. "I don't just see the solution, Mom. I see the mistake the person who wrote the original code made 20 years ago. It's a foundational flaw." Silas paused, looking up at her. "Should I stop it? It's going to crash the whole global system if I don't." Tasha looked at the horizon. She thought of the man who had chosen a throne over her. She thought of the child who was now more powerful than that throne. "The world doesn't deserve to go dark because of one man's ego, Silas," she said, her voice steady. "Fix the code, but leave no trace." "Too late for that," Silas murmured, his eyes reflecting a sudden surge of data. "To kill the parasite, I have to send a handshake back to the source. They'll see my IP. They'll see me. Tasha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning breeze. The silence of the last 10 years was about to shatter. Then let them see, she said, her hand resting on her son's shoulder. Let them see exactly what they lost. The command center in Seoul had fallen into a tomb-like silence. The red emergency lights had ceased their frantic pulsing, replaced by a cool, steady blue. On the massive central monitor, the chaotic, jagged lines of the logic bomb, the parasite, as the technicians called it, had smoothed into a perfect rhythmic sine wave. The global grid was breathing again. Hyun-Jae stood paralyzed, his eyes fixed on the terminal. What just happened? Sir. The head of cybersecurity, a man who had been a lead architect at the NSA before being lured to H-Tech, looked like he had seen a ghost. Someone just patched it from the outside. The bounty? Hyun-Jae asked, his voice low. Only 20 minutes prior, in a fit of cold desperation, he had authorized a $50 million black hat bounty on the dark web, a digital flare sent into the void, praying for a genius or a mercenary to answer. Yes, sir. A user, IDS-S. They didn't just bypass the firewall, they rewrote the kernel's defensive logic while the attack was live. It took them 42 minutes. It would have taken our entire Tier 1 team 3 months. The technician's hands shook as he pulled up the trace. They didn't even take the money. They left the bounty sitting in the escrow account. Hyun-Jae's eyes narrowed. In his world, no one did anything for free. Power was the only currency he understood. Trace the handshake. I want a name. I want a location. If this is a state-level operative from Beijing or a shadow cell in Russia, I need to know who owns them. We're already on it, Chairman. The ping originated from a residential ISP. It's messy. They used 7 layers of spoofing, but they left a breadcrumb trail in the final line of the patch, almost like a signature. On the screen, a single line of code was highlighted in gold. Phase 2, / optimized by S-S. Your 2014 architecture had a leak. Fix your house. Hyun-Jae felt a phantom ache in his chest. 2014. That was the year he had finalized the H-Tech core, the same year he had signed the papers that ended his marriage, the same year he had chosen this house over the woman who had been his home. I have the terminal location, sir, the technician announced, his voice filled with disbelief. It's not a government facility. It's a private residence in Great Falls, Virginia, USA. A sleeper agent? Hyun-Jae mused, his mind already calculating the geopolitical fallout. I don't think so, sir. The IP is registered to a private citizen, one Tasha Henry. The name hit Hyun-Jae with the force of a physical blow. The air in the room seemed to vanish. The faces of his directors, the hum of the servers, the glow of the screens, it all blurred into a hazy, distant roar. Tasha! He hadn't spoken her name in 10 years. He had buried it under layers of steel and silicon, convincing himself that she was a chapter of a lesser life, a woman who couldn't understand the demands of an empire. He pictured her as he had left her, 55, eyes bright with unshed tears, standing in the rain as he drove away to claim his crown. He had assumed she had faded into a quiet, unremarkable retirement. Chairman, should we contact the State Department? Hyun-Jae didn't answer. He walked toward the screen, his reflection ghosting over the map of Virginia. No, he said, his voice regaining its edge, though now it was sharpened by an obsessive curiosity. Prepare the jet. I'm going to Virginia. Sir, the board meeting for the merger is in 12 hours. Cancel it, Hyun-Jae snapped, not turning around. I want to see the ghost who knows my house better than I do, and I want to know why she's harboring them. Virginia, USA. In the quiet of the morning, Silas closed his laptop with a soft thud. He looked up at Tasha, who was still standing by the window, her silhouette framed by the golden light of the rising sun. "I finished," Silas said, his voice small but steady. "I closed the door and locked it behind me." Tasha turned, her expression unreadable. She knew the digital world. She knew that a handshake in cyberspace was as loud as a gunshot in a library. "He's coming, isn't he?" Silas nodded once. "He's the chairman. He has to know who beat him. His systems are already pinging our router, trying to find a name." Tasha walked over and ran a hand through Silas's dark, thick hair, like the man who was currently boarding a Gulfstream in Seoul. For 10 years, she had protected this peace. She had raised a boy who could speak to machines, who was kind, who was whole. "Are you afraid, Mom?" Silas asked. Tasha smiled, a slow, dangerous, and beautiful curve of the lips. "No, Silas. I'm not the one who should be afraid. He's coming here expecting a weapon. He has no idea he's about to find a mirror." She looked at her reflection in the darkened screen of the laptop. At 65, she was more formidable than she had ever been at 55. She had nothing to hide and nothing to prove. "Let him come," she whispered. "Let him see what it looks like when the world he rejected creates something he can never own." The Gulfstream G700 cut through the Atlantic skies like a silver needle, but inside the cabin, the atmosphere was pressurized with a different kind of tension. Park Hyun-Jae did not sleep. He sat in the hand-stitched leather chair, a glass of untouched scotch sweating on the sideboard, staring at a grainy satellite image of a house in Great Falls, Virginia. It was a home, not a compound, not a fortress, just a house. "Chairman, we will touch down in 30 minutes, his assistant whispered, hovering near the galley. "The black cars are waiting at Dulles. Shall I alert the local authorities that you are arriving for a private security matter?" "No," Hyun-Jae said, his voice raspy from hours of silence. "This isn't a security matter. It's a ghost hunt." He was 65, and for the first time in a decade, his heart was racing for something other than a closing bell. He told himself it was the code. He told himself he was there to recruit the operative who had embarrassed his entire IT department. But deep in the marrow of his bones, he knew. He knew the name on the ISP registration. Tasha. The drive from the airport was a blur of autumn leaves and suburban tranquility. When the black sedan finally pulled up to the curb of the craftsman-style home, Hyun-Jae stepped out into the crisp Virginia air. The garden was meticulously kept, lavender, rosemary, and white roses. It smelled like her. It smelled like the life he had once promised her, before his uncle had whispered poisoned words about legacy and purity into his ear. He walked up the stone path, his polished Oxfords crunching on the gravel. He reached the door and paused. He was a man who moved markets with a nod, yet his hand trembled as he reached for the brass knocker. He knocked 3 times, solid, authoritative. The door didn't creak. It swung open smoothly, revealing a hallway bathed in warm, natural light. And there she was. Tasha Henry didn't look like a woman who had spent 10 years in mourning. At 65, she was radiant. Her skin was glowing, her silver hair styled beautifully, and framed a face etched with the wisdom of a woman who had survived the storm and come out the owner of the wind. She wore a cream cashmere sweater and high-waisted trousers. Simple, expensive, and devastatingly composed. The shock was physical. It felt as if the air had been sucked out of the street. "Hyun-Jae," she said. Her voice was like silk over gravel. Calm, steady, and entirely devoid of the desperation he had expected. "Tasha," he managed to choke out. His mind was a scramble of 1,000 apologies and a million questions, but his tongue was lead. You're the one. The IP, the patch." Tasha leaned against the doorframe, a ghost of a smirk playing on her lips. "I'm the one who pays the internet bill, Hyun-Jae. But I'm not the one who saved your empire. I believe you're looking for the architect. She stepped aside. Standing in the shadows of the foyer was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 10. He was wearing a NASA t-shirt and cargo pants, but it was his face that stopped Hyun-Jae's heart. The boy had Hyun-Jae's brow. He had Hyun-Jae's sharp, feline eyes. He had the same stubborn set of the jaw that looked back at Hyun-Jae from the mirror every morning. In the boy's hands was a high-end tablet. The screen was bright, displaying a scrolling terminal of raw C++ code, the internal proprietary heartbeat of H-Tech. Shock 1. This child was the SS who had outpaced 1,000 engineers. Shock 2. The child was a living, breathing calculation of time. 10 years ago, she had been 55. He had left her. She told the truth. She had been pregnant. And it was his. "Hello, Chairman," the boy said, his voice high but unnervingly precise. He didn't look intimidated. He looked curious, like a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen of an old dying star. "You have a memory leak in your secondary encryption layer. I'm patching it now, but you really should consider a complete rewrite of the kernel." Hyun-Jae felt the world tilt. He gripped the door frame to keep from collapsing. He looked from the boy, his son, to Tasha, who stood there with her arms crossed, watching him with the detached pity of someone watching a man realize he'd spent a decade hoarding fool's gold while his real treasure was growing in the sun. 10 years, Hyun-Jae whispered, his eyes stinging. Tasha took a step forward, her presence suddenly filling the doorway, eclipsing the power he thought he brought with him. 10 years ago, you chose a house built of glass and silicon, she said, her voice dropping to a low, vibrato warning. And I decided to build a home of flesh and blood. You came here for a genius, Hyun-Jae. But look closely. You're looking at the only thing in this world your trillions can't buy. Silas tapped a final command on his tablet and looked up. Everything complete, Mom. Can we go get ice cream? The suburban silence of Great Falls was punctured only by the rhythmic ticking of a cooling engine from Hyun-Jae's sedan. He stood on the porch, a man who had dictated the terms of global mergers, feeling like a beggar at a feast he had once owned. I have a check in my pocket, Hyun-Jae began, his voice regaining that hard transactional edge, the only armor he had left. The bounty was 50 million. I'll quintuple it. I'll set up a trust for the boy. I'll provide the best tutors, the best labs in Seoul, a security detail. Tasha didn't even let him finish. She didn't move an inch, her body a physical barrier between the world's most powerful man and the quiet life she had cultivated. You're doing it again, Hyun-Jae, she said, her voice laced with a terrifyingly calm disappointment. You're trying to solve a human problem with a ledger. Silas isn't an asset for your portfolio. He's a 10-year-old who wants chocolate chip mint ice cream. Your money is loud and, quite frankly, it's boring. He is a genius. Hyun-Jae stepped forward, his eyes wild with a mixture of greed and a sudden desperate possessiveness. He solved the recursive loop. My best engineers, men with PhDs from MIT, couldn't touch it. He belongs in a place that can foster that mind. He belongs at H-Tech. He belongs with me, Tasha countered. Her gaze was level, unshakable. And you? You belong in your penthouse, surrounded by the silence you traded me for. Hyun-Jae reached for the door handle, an instinctive move of a man used to entering any room he desired. Tasha's hand clamped over his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong, the skin of her hand warm against his cold, expensive watch. Don't, she warned. You aren't invited in. Not today. Not 10 years ago. Not ever. Tasha, look at him. Hyun-Jae pointed at Silas, who was watching the exchange with a detached, analytical gaze, as if he were debugging a particularly messy piece of legacy code. He is exceptional. I need to understand how. You want to understand? Tasha leaned in, her voice a low vibration that only he could hear. Then go back to your hotel. Do the math you're so proud of. Look at the date I left Seoul. Look at the date he was born. And then ask yourself why a woman who loved you would rather raise a miracle in a storm than bring him into the house of a man who chooses cold steel over a beating heart. She stepped back and closed the door. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home echoed like a gunshot in the quiet afternoon. Hyun-Jae stood on the porch, his hand still hovering in the air. He felt small. He felt 65 years of age pressing down on his shoulders like a leaden cloak. He walked back to the car, his movements stiff. Inside the darkened interior of the sedan, his assistant waited, tablet in hand. Chairman, the board is calling. They want to know if the SS operative has been secured for a contract. Be quiet, Hyun-Jae snapped. He pulled his own phone from his pocket. His fingers, usually so precise, fumbled as he navigated to his private archives. He scrolled back through the digital ghost trail of his life. September 14th, 2015. The day the divorce papers were finalized. The day he had watched her walk out of the glass tower without a single backward glance. Then he opened the file his investigators had just pinged to him. The birth certificate of Silas Henry. June 12th, 2016. Hyun-Jae's breath hitched. He closed his eyes, his mind performing the one calculation he had spent a decade avoiding. 9 months. Exactly 9 months after their last night together. The night he had told her he was choosing the chairmanship, and she had told him he was making a mistake he would never be able to fix. He looked out the window at the modest house. The lights were warm inside. He could see the silhouette of the boy sitting at the kitchen table and the silhouette of the woman he had discarded, leaning over him, likely helping with a homework assignment that was far too easy for him. Silas wasn't just a genius he had found. Silas was his genius, his blood, his air, his soul, walking around outside of his body in a NASA t-shirt. Chairman, the assistant asked tentatively, should we head to the airport? Hyun-Jae looked at the house one last time, a predatory light igniting in his eyes, softened by a sudden agonizing yearning. No, Hyun-Jae whispered, his voice trembling with a new terrifying purpose. Cancel the flight. Cancel everything. I'm not leaving Virginia until they're mine. The morning air in Great Falls was usually punctuated by the song of chickadees, but today it was choked by the low hum of 3 idling black Escalades. Hyun-Jae did not come himself this time. Instead, he sent his legion. 4 men and 2 women in razor-crease navy suits stood on Tasha's porch, led by Kang, a man whose legal reputation in Seoul was that of a reaper. He held a leather briefcase that likely cost more than the average American's annual mortgage. When Tasha opened the door, she didn't look surprised. She was dressed in a charcoal turtleneck and slacks, holding a simple manila folder. Ms. Henry, Kang said, bowing with a practiced chilly politeness. I represent H-Tech and Chairman Park. We are here to discuss the formal recognition of Silas Henry as the primary heir to the Park estate and the subsequent custody and educational transition arrangements. Tasha didn't invite them in. She leaned against the doorframe, her expression one of mild boredom. You're using a lot of syllables to say kidnapping, Mr. Kang. We prefer restitution, Kang replied, clicking open his briefcase to reveal a thick stack of documents. The chairman is prepared to offer an immediate settlement of $500 million into a blind trust in your name, in exchange for Silas's relocation to Seoul for his specialized schooling. You will, of course, have visitation rights. Tasha didn't even glance at the money. She simply handed him the manila folder she was holding. What is this? Kang asked. Your education, Tasha said. Kang opened the folder. His professional mask slipped for a fraction of a second. Inside were not photos or emotional pleas. They were spreadsheets, tax returns, and legal filings from the last 10 years. Page 1, Tasha directed, her voice like cooling lava. That is a record of the 3 letters I sent to Hyun-Jae's personal office in the first 6 months after I arrived in the U.S. They were returned unopened, marked refused by recipient. That is the legal definition of willful abandonment of a pregnant spouse. Kang tried to interrupt. The chairman was under immense pressure. Page 4, Tasha talked over him. Those are my tax returns. You'll notice I don't work for a firm. I'm an independent strategic consultant for 3 Fortune 50 firms. My net worth is more than enough to provide Silas with a life of luxury, private security, and any lab he desires. I don't need Hyun-Jae's trillions. In fact, in the eyes of a Virginia family court, his sudden interest looks less like fatherly love and more like the predatory acquisition of a minor's intellectual property. She stepped out onto the porch, forcing the suit-clad phalanx to take a step back. You all told him I was too old 10 years ago, she said, her eyes pinning Kang to the spot. You told him I was a distraction. Now, you're on my porch because the distraction raised the only person smart enough to save your company. Go back to your hotel. Tell Hyun-Jae that if he wants to see his son, he can't send a contract. He has to send a man. And since I haven't seen one of those in a suit from Seoul in a decade, he's going to be waiting a long time. Behind her, the door opened. Silas appeared, eating a piece of toast. He looked at the high-powered lawyers as if they were a bug in his code. Mr. Kang? Silas asked, his young voice echoing in the quiet street. Kang straightened up, hoping for a breakthrough. Yes, Silas? You're using an older version of the H-Tech encryption on that tablet in your hand, the boy said, pointing at the lawyer's hand. I cracked that version when I was 7. If I were you, I'd worry more about your own security and less about mine. Silas turned and walked back inside. Tasha smiled at the stunned lawyers. You heard the genius. Your house is leaking. Fix it before you come back to mine. She closed the door. Inside the lead Escalade, parked a block away, Hyun-Jae listened to the entire exchange through a remote feed. He sat in the dark, his hand over his mouth. He had expected her to cry, to scream about the past, or to greedily grab at the money. Instead, she had dismantled his best legal team in under 5 minutes with nothing but the truth and her own success. She didn't need him. That was the most terrifying thing he had ever realized. Chairman? Kang's voice crackled over the comms. She has a very strong no-contact defense, and the boy is remarkably loyal to her. What are our orders? Hyun-Jae watched Tasha's silhouette through the window of the house. Withdraw, he whispered. She's right. I've been sending soldiers to a sanctuary. I have to do this myself. The skyline of Seoul was a jagged crown of glass and neon, but inside the private library of the Park family estate, the air felt ancient and stagnant. Park Min-ho, Hyun-Jae's uncle, and the man who had spent 40 years pruning the family tree with a blood-stained sickle, stared at the high-definition photograph on his desk. It was a long-lens shot taken from a van in Great Falls, Virginia. It showed Tasha Henry laughing as she handed a lunchbox to a boy who shared the unmistakable, razor-sharp profile of the Park lineage. 10 years, Min-ho hissed, his voice like dry parchment rubbing together. I told Hyun-Jae that woman was a barren field. I told him she was a gold digger who would drain the H-Tech coffers and give him nothing but grief. Standing across from him was a man in a shadow gray suit, his fixer, a former intelligence officer who specialized in the kind of problems that didn't exist on paper. She didn't take a cent, sir, the fixer reported. That's the problem. She's clean. She's built a consultancy firm with a Tier 1 security clearance in the States. If we attack her finances, we trip alarms with the U.S. Commerce Department. Min-ho's grip tightened on his cane. His own sons were competent enough, but they were the kind of men who spent their inheritance on European football clubs and yachts. They weren't geniuses. If Hyun-Jae brought this boy back... This SS, who had humiliated the H-Tech board, Minho's bloodline would be relegated to the footnotes of the empire's history. Genius is a fragile thing, Minho murmured, his eyes narrowing. And Tasha Henry is an American citizen, a foreigner, an outsider who kept the chairman's only heir in a primitive Western environment. She stole 10 years of the boy's training. He stood up, walking to the window that looked out over the H-Tech headquarters. Hyun-Jae is compromised by sentimentality. He thinks he's going there to win a family. We need to make sure that when he looks at her, he doesn't see a lost love. He needs to see a kidnapper, a woman who used his seed to create a weapon against his own company. What are your instructions? The fixer asked. Start with the Korean tabloids, Minho commanded. I want the narrative set in motion immediately. The secret American bastard. The woman who hid the heir for $1 billion ransom. And find out who her clients are in the U.S. If any of them have ties to our competitors, leak it. Make it look like she's been grooming the boy to sell H-Tech secrets to the highest bidder. Minho turned back to the photo, his finger tracing the boy's face. He looks like his father. That is his greatest strength, and we will make it his greatest curse. If we can't buy the boy, we will make the world so toxic that the boy will have no choice but to renounce his mother to save his own name. He paused, a cruel smile touching his lips. And Tasha, I want her reminded of why she left 10 years ago. Send her a gift. Something to remind her that in soul, she is nothing but the shadow of a trillionaire's mistake. Virginia, USA. The delivery arrived at noon, a simple, unmarked black box. Tasha opened it in the kitchen. Inside was a single withered hibiscus flower, the national flower of Korea, and a copy of the divorce decree from 10 years ago, stamped with a notice of no intent to reopen from the Park Family Council. Attached was a small, handwritten note in elegant traditional calligraphy. The soil of Korea does not accept foreign seeds. Stay in your garden or be uprooted. Tasha didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She picked up the withered flower and walked to the trash can, dropping it in with a dull thud. Mom? Silas asked, looking up from a complex schematic of a quantum processor. Who sent that? Tasha looked at her son. Her miracle, her genius, her heart. She saw the Park fire in his eyes, but she had tempered it with her own steel. An old man who is afraid of the future, Silas, she said softly. She walked to the counter and picked up her phone. She dialed a number she hadn't called in a decade, the direct line to the H-Tech chairman. Hyun-Jae picked up on the first ring. Tasha? Your uncle just sent me a threat, Hyun-Jae, she said, her voice like a cold snap in autumn. He thinks I'm the same woman he bullied out of Seoul 10 years ago. He thinks I'm hiding. He's wrong. Tasha, I didn't know. I'll handle him. No, she interrupted. You won't handle him. We will. Pack your things, Hyun-Jae. Silas and I are coming to Seoul. Not because you asked, and not because of your money. We're coming because I'm going to show your family what happens when they try to touch what belongs to me. She hung up and looked at Silas. Pack your laptop, honey. We're going to go fix a very old, very broken machine. The private hangar at Dulles was a cathedral of chrome and hushed voices. Park Hyun-Jae stood by the boarding stairs of his G700, watching as Tasha's modest SUV pulled onto the tarmac. He felt a strange, jarring surge of hope. He had won a battle. They were going to Seoul. But as Tasha stepped out, her chin high and her eyes like flint, he realized he hadn't won her. He had only earned a temporary alliance against a common enemy. Silas, Hyun-Jae said, stepping forward as the boy emerged, carrying a weathered backpack that looked absurdly small against the backdrop of a $100 million jet. I've had the onboard server upgraded. It's a 10 petabyte liquid-cooled array. You can run any simulation you want during the flight. Silas looked at the plane, then at the row of bowing flight attendants. It's a lot of fuel for 3 people, he remarked, then walked past his father and up the stairs without another word. Midway through the flight, while Tasha slept in the forward cabin, her face peaceful, looking 10 years younger in the soft, dimmable light, Hyun-Jae found Silas in the lounge. The boy was staring at a holographic display he'd projected from his own tablet, a complex lattice of light that shifted as he moved his fingers. Silas, Hyun-Jae began, sitting across from him. He cleared his throat, feeling more nervous than he did before a hostile takeover. I know this is a lot. I know I haven't been there, but I want to make it up to you, not just with toys, but with the future. He tapped a button on the table, and a 3D architectural rendering bloomed between them. It was a sprawling subterranean complex beneath the H-Tech headquarters. I've spent the last 48 hours finalizing the blueprints, Hyun-Jae said, his voice brimming with the excitement of a man who believed everything had a price. It's a $500 million dedicated R&D facility. It has a direct tap into the national power grid, a private satellite uplink, and the only commercial-grade quantum processor in East Asia. It's yours. No board of directors, no oversight. Just you, the code, and the world's best hardware. You'll never have to worry about a memory leak. Hyun-Jae waited for the spark. He waited for the wide-eyed wonder he saw in the children of his directors when he gave them mere iPhones. Silas didn't even look at the hologram. He kept his eyes on the small, scratched-up Raspberry Pi board he had pulled from his backpack, a tiny green circuit board no larger than a credit card, held together by a piece of electrical tape. When I was 6, Silas said quietly, we lived in a small apartment in Richmond. Mom was working 3 jobs as a consultant, trying to get her firm off the ground. She didn't buy new clothes for 2 years, but for my birthday, she took her last $50, literally the last of the grocery money for that week, and bought me this. He held up the tiny cheap board. She told me that a machine is just a box, but the logic I put into it is my voice. She taught me that the most powerful code in the world is the kind that solves a problem for someone who has nothing. Silas looked his father in the eye, and for a moment, Hyun-Jae saw the ghost of the man he used to be before the money took his sight. Your lab is impressive, Chairman, Silas said, the title hitting Hyun-Jae like a cold splash of water. But it's built on top of a company that tried to erase my mother. It's built on legacy and valuation. It has no soul. You think you're giving me a world, but you're just trying to buy a son. Silas stood up, tucking the tiny circuit board into his pocket. My mom gave me a voice with $50. You're trying to silence your conscience with $500 million. I fixed your company because she asked me to, but I don't want your lab. He walked toward the sleeping quarters, leaving Hyun-Jae alone with his glowing, $500 million hologram. The lights of the display flickered, casting long, lonely shadows across the cabin. Hyun-Jae reached out to touch the light, but his hand passed right through it. There was nothing there to grab onto. He realized then that Tasha hadn't just raised a genius. She had raised a judge, and the verdict was coming for him. The descent into Incheon International Airport felt like a re-entry into a previous life, but the atmosphere was far from a homecoming. As the G700 taxied toward a private terminal, the cabin's monitors flickered to life, slave to the local news cycle. Hyun-Jae's face paled as he watched the scrolling banners of the Korean news networks. Minho had moved faster than anticipated. The Trillionaire's secret. Who is the foreign woman hiding the park air? H-Tech scandal. Was the global outage a ransom plot by a discarded lover? The screen flashed a grainy 10-year-old photo of Tasha, looking young, heartbroken, and exhausted, contrasted against a modern shot of her in Virginia. The narrative was being spun with surgical precision. She was a social climber who had fled with company secrets in her womb, only to resurface when the empire was vulnerable. They're calling me a blackmailer, Tasha said, her voice terrifyingly level. She stood behind Hyun-Jae, watching the screen. Your family hasn't changed their script, Hyun-Jae. Just the medium. I will have it taken down, Hyun-Jae snapped, his fingers trembling as he dialed his head of PR. I will sue every outlet. You can't sue the wind, Tasha interrupted. She looked at Silas, who was wearing noise-canceling headphones, staring out the window at the approaching hangars. No, Hyun-Jae said, turning to face her. The ruthless spark that had built H-Tech returned to his eyes. I brought you here so the world could see who was actually standing in the light. The cabin door hissed open. A wall of humid Seoul air rushed in, accompanied by the distant roar of 100 camera shutters. Beyond the security perimeter, a sea of reporters and protesters, likely paid by Minho, held signs demanding purity for H-Tech. Hyun-Jae stepped out first. He didn't hide his face. He didn't use the privacy umbrellas the security team offered. He stood at the top of the stairs, a silver-haired titan, and waited. Then he reached back. He offered his hand to Tasha. It wasn't the gesture of a captor or a businessman. It was a silent plea. Tasha looked at his hand for a long moment, her eyes searching his. She didn't take it. Instead, she stepped forward on her own power, her head held so high it seemed to command the very sun to shine on her. Behind her came Silas. The crowd went silent for a heartbeat. The boy was the image of Hyun-Jae, yet he moved with a calm American ease that was entirely foreign to the rigid structures of Seoul. He didn't look at the cameras. He looked at the architecture of the terminal, his mind likely calculating the stress loads of the steel beams. Hyun-Jae walked to the bank of microphones that had been illegally set up at the edge of the tarmac. His security team moved to dismantle them, but he waved them off. I have one statement, Hyun-Jae's voice boomed, carried by the wind and the live feeds of 10 million smartphones. 10 years ago, I made a mistake. I allowed whispers of legacy to blind me to the truth of what a legacy actually is. He looked back at Tasha, then at Silas. This is Tasha Henry. She is not a secret. She is the woman who raised the most brilliant mind I have ever encountered. And this is Silas Park Henry. He did not come here to claim an inheritance. He came here because the company I built was too weak to survive without his intervention. The reporters erupted into a frenzy of questions. Is he the heir? Will he take the chairmanship? What about the uncle's claims? My son owes H-Tech nothing, Hyun-Jae said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low vibrato. H-Tech owes him everything. And as for my family, he looked directly into a camera, knowing Minho was watching from his dark library. The doors of the Park estate are closed to those who live in the shadows, but they are open to the truth. We are going home. He led them toward a fleet of armored black sedans. As Tasha slid into the backseat of the lead car, she looked at the towering skyline of the city that had once rejected her. The people aren't cheering for your money, Hyun-Jae. They're staring at the boy who saved their phones, their banks, and their lives. You think you're protecting us? You've just given Silas the keys to the city. I hope you're ready for what he does with them. The motorcade surged forward, a black ribbon cutting through the heart of Seoul, while the internet exploded with a single viral image. A 10-year-old boy in a NASA hoodie, standing between a trillionaire and a queen, looking as if he owned the earth beneath their feet. The H-Tech boardroom was a theater of cold glass and colder hearts, suspended 60 floors above the Seoul pavement. The air was pressurized, smelling of ozone and expensive cologne. Around the mahogany table sat the 7 sages, the board members who 10 years ago had sat in these very chairs and voted to approve a severance package for Tasha Henry, treating her like a bug in a pristine system. They were older now, their faces etched with the bitterness of men who had traded their souls for equity, and they were terrified. The double doors swung open. Hyun-Jae entered first, his presence usually enough to command a standing ovation. But today, he didn't head for the head of the table. He stepped aside. Tasha walked in. She wore a suit of midnight blue, the fabric shimmering like deep water. She didn't look for a seat. She occupied the room. Behind her, Silas trailed, his eyes fixed on the massive digital array that occupied the northern wall. The silence was deafening. Director Choi, a man who had once told Tasha to know her place as a temporary diversion, cleared his throat, his face a mottled purple. "Chairman," Choi began, his voice trembling, "this is highly irregular. A child and a private citizen in the inner sanctum? We are in the middle of the Phase 2 launch. The global network is still in a state of read-only. If we don't unlock the administrative keys, the markets will collapse at the opening bell." "Then you should have hired better engineers, Director Choi," Tasha said. Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried the weight of a gavel. She walked slowly around the table, her hand grazing the back of Choi's chair. He flinched. "I remember this room. I remember the last time I stood here. You told me I was beneath the dignity of this family. You told me my background was a liability to the brand." "Ms. Henry, this is not the time for personal grievances," another director barked. "The encryption is locked. The SS patch created a secondary firewall that our entire tech team can't penetrate. We need the bypass." "You don't need a bypass," Silas interjected. He had wandered to the main terminal, his small fingers already hovering over the haptic glass. The firewall isn't a wall. It's a mirror. It's checking for the original architecture's signature. And since the original architecture was built on a stolen logic gate from 2014, the one you used to spy on your own employees, it's rejecting your authority. The board members went pale. The secret surveillance protocols of 2014 were the company's black box, a scandal that would ruin them all if it ever leaked. "Unlock it, boy," Choi hissed. "We will pay you, whatever you want, $1 billion, 10 billion? Silas stopped. He turned, looking at the man with a gaze that was far too old for a 10-year-old face. "I don't want your money. I have a Nintendo Switch and a mom who makes great pancakes. I'm good." He looked at Tasha. The power in the room shifted so violently, it was almost visible. Hyun-Jae, the trillionaire, the chairman, stood in the corner, realizing he was no longer the protagonist of his own life. "He doesn't take orders from H-Tech," Tasha said, stepping into the light at the head of the table. She didn't sit in the chairman's throne. She stood behind it, her hands resting on the leather. "And he doesn't take orders from his father. He takes orders from the person who taught him that integrity is the only code that doesn't break." "What do you want?" Choi whispered, defeated. Tasha looked at the men who had mocked her race, her age, and her heart. "I want you to sit in this silence for a moment," she said. "I want you to feel the weight of a world that is held together by a 10-year-old you didn't want to exist, and then I want a formal public apology. Not to me, but to every person whose life you disrupted to protect your purity." She looked at Silas and nodded. "One condition," Silas said, his fingers finally touching the screen. "I'm deleting the surveillance gate. From now on, H-Tech stays out of people's private lives. If you try to rebuild it, I'll know, and I'll turn your entire grid into a digital graveyard." With a single rhythmic tap, Silas hit the enter key. The monitors turned from red to a brilliant cooling white. The Phase 2 lock shattered. Across the globe, billions of devices hummed back to life. The Empire was saved. But as the director slumped in relief, Tasha leaned over the table, her eyes locking onto Choi's. "The Empire is back," she whispered. "But the keys? My son keeps those. You're just tenants now." She turned and walked out, Silas by her side. Hyun-Jae followed them, a man chasing a sun he had spent 10 years trying to extinguish, only to find it was the only thing keeping him warm. The aftermath of the system restoration felt less like a celebration and more like a surrender. The 7 sages of the board sat in the radiant glow of the functioning monitors, but their eyes were fixed on the woman standing at the head of the mahogany expanse. Director Choi, recovering some of his bluster now that his stock options were no longer evaporating, straightened his silk tie. He looked at Silas, who was leaning against the window, bored by the gargantuan machines he had just tamed. Now that the crisis is averted, Choi said, his voice regaining its oily corporate timbre, we must discuss the transition. The Park family bylaws are quite clear about the succession of a male heir with such documented aptitude. We will begin the process of enrolling Silas in the Academy of Science and Technology. He will need to be groomed. We'll need to settle the matter of his legal guardianship to ensure he is under the H-Tech umbrella. Hyun-Jae stepped forward, his mouth opening to speak, but Tasha's hand went up, a single, sharp gesture that froze the room. Succession? Tasha asked. She began to walk, not toward the exit, but toward the chairman's throne, the massive, ergonomically perfect seat of power that Hyun-Jae had occupied for 3 decades. She didn't sit in it. She placed one hand on its headrest and spun it around so it faced the board. It was empty, a hollow vessel of leather and steel. 10 years ago, Tasha said, her voice dropping into a register that made the glass walls seem to vibrate. I sat in the waiting room of this very floor. I was 55, pregnant, and terrified. I waited 6 hours for a meeting that never happened. Instead, you sent a junior associate with a check and a non-disclosure agreement. You called me an obstruction. You told Hyun-Jae I was beneath the dignity of this chair. Tasha, I didn't know the extent of their... Hyun-Jae started, his face pained. You knew enough to stay in the room while I walked out of it, she countered, her gaze never leaving the board. She turned her attention back to Choi. You want to groom him? You want to bring him under your umbrella? She laughed, a short, sharp sound that contained no mirth. Look at that screen, she commanded, pointing to the code Silas had just written. That isn't just math. That is the architecture of the next 50 years of global commerce, and every line of it was taught by me. Every moral safeguard, every encryption logic, every soul in that machine was forged in a house you didn't pay for, in a country you don't control. She walked over to Silas and put a hand on his shoulder. The boy looked up at her, his loyalty absolute, his genius a quiet fire. You talk about your legacy as if it's something you can inherit through a blood test and a legal filing, Tasha said. But look at your chairman. He is 65, and he is the last of his kind. Your legacy isn't in your vaults. Your legacy is coded in my son's DNA. She leaned over the table, her face inches from Choi's. But here is the part you aren't understanding. He doesn't work for H-Tech. He doesn't work for the Park family. And he certainly doesn't work for a man who chose a chair over a child. Then who does he work for? Choi stammered. He works for me, Tasha whispered, because I'm the only person in this room who saw his value when he was nothing but a heartbeat and a hope. I didn't need this chair 10 years ago, and I don't need it now. But look at yourselves. Your systems are stable only because he allows it. Your wealth exists only because he hasn't deleted it. She straightened up, her presence dwarfing the skyscraper itself. The chair doesn't confer power on the person sitting in it anymore, she said, looking at Hyun-Jae. The chair is just a piece of furniture. The power is in the room because we are in it, and we are leaving. Tasha, wait, Hyun-Jae pleaded, stepping into her path. You can't just take him back to Virginia. The world knows who he is now. Minho won't stop. The board won't stop. Tasha looked at the man she had once loved, the man who was now realizing that his trillion-dollar empire was a cage of his own making. Then you'd better start learning how to be a father instead of a chairman, Hyun-Jae, she said, because if you want to be near this legacy, you're going to have to follow it, and I don't give tours of my home to strangers. She walked out, the click of her heels echoing like a countdown. Silas followed, tossing a casual wave over his shoulder at the stunned directors. Hyun-Jae stood alone in the center of the boardroom, looking at the empty throne. For the first time in his life, he realized the chair wasn't a prize. It was a tomb, and the only way out was to follow the woman who had already outrun him. The penthouse of the H-Tech flagship hotel was a fortress of glass, but inside, the air was heavy with the scent of old sins. Tasha sat by the window, watching the rain blur the lights of Seoul into 1,000 weeping neon eyes. Silas was on the floor, surrounded by 3 different laptops and a tangle of proprietary cables. His fingers were moving with a rhythmic, percussive speed that signaled he was no longer just fixing a system. He was hunting. "I found it, Mom," Silas said. His voice was flat, the way it got when the logic of the world disappointed him. "Found what, Silas?" Tasha asked, her heart tightening. "The reason you left. The real reason." Before she could answer, the door chimed. Hyun-Jae entered, looking haggard. He had stripped off his suit jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He looked less like a trillionaire and more like a man who had been wandering in a desert for a decade. "Hyun-Jae, you need to see this," Tasha said, her voice a low warning. Hyun-Jae walked over, looking down at his son's screen. "Silas, if this is about the server logs—" "It's about 2014, Silas interrupted. He didn't look up. He tapped a key, and a series of encrypted internal memos from the Park Family Council archives bloomed across the screen. They were dated 2 weeks before the divorce. "You thought Mom was selling company secrets to the Americans. You thought she had a secret bank account in the Cayman Islands with $5 million from a competitor." Hyun-Jae stiffened. The evidence was irrefutable. The digital footprint, the wire transfers, it was all tied to her private terminal. "It was a spoofed MAC address, Dad," Silas said, using the word dad for the first time. It hit Hyun-Jae like a physical blow, but the boy's tone was clinical. "Look at the routing headers. The signal didn't come from Mom's office. It was bounced through a proxy server located in the basement of the Park family estate, specifically from a terminal registered to Park Min-ho." Hyun-Jae's breath hitched. He leaned closer, his eyes scanning the lines of code that Silas was highlighting in red. That's impossible. My uncle was the one who found the leak. He was the one who protected the company while I was distracted by my marriage." "He didn't find the leak," Silas said, standing up and handing the tablet to his father. "He manufactured it. He used a recursive algorithm, an early version of the one I just patched, to plant the evidence on Mom's computer. He even scripted the anonymous tips to the board." Hyun-Jae scrolled through the files. He saw the cold, calculated messages between his uncle and a high-level hacker. "Subject is becoming too influential," one memo read. "Chairman's focus is wavering. Remove the American. Use the legacy protocol." The tablet slipped from Hyun-Jae's fingers, landing with a soft thud on the rug. The silence in the room was absolute. Hyun-Jae looked at Tasha. She was standing now, her face a mask of cold, hard recognition. She didn't look vindicated. She looked heartbroken for the man he had become because of a lie. "He told me you were all for the money," Hyun-Jae whispered, his voice breaking. "He told me the pregnancy, if there was any, wasn't even mine. He showed me the medical records from the clinic saying I was sterile." "And you believed him," Tasha said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of the fact that had defined their decade apart. "You believed the man who wanted your chair more than the woman who shared your bed." Hyun-Jae let out a ragged, choked sound, half sob, half growl. The realization shattered him. His 10 years of loneliness, the coldness he had cultivated like armor, the way he had pushed Tasha away to protect his empire, it had all been a play written by his own blood. He had burned his own garden because his uncle told him the roses were poisonous. "He took everything," Hyun-Jae rasped, his eyes fixed on the door. He took my son's first steps. He took your smile. He took 10 years of my life. He turned, his face transforming into a mask of lethal, focused rage. The silver fox was gone. The predator was back. Where are you going? Tasha asked. To end a legacy, Hyun-Jae said. Wait, Silas said, grabbing his backpack. He has a backdoor kill switch in the H-Tech mainframe. If you just fire him, he'll crash the whole grid out of spite. He's already hovering over the trigger. Hyun-Jae stopped. He looked at his son, the genius who saw the traps before they were sprung. How do we stop him? Hyun-Jae asked. Silas looked at Tasha, then back at his father. A small, grim smile touched the boy's lips. We don't stop him. We let him think he's winning. Then, I'm going to give him exactly what he deserves. Total, digital non-existence. The Park family estate was a fortress of tradition, but tonight it felt like a mausoleum. Rain lashed against the ancient eaves as Hyun-Jae stepped into the library. He didn't come with guards. He didn't come with lawyers. He came with a tablet and the cold, quiet fury of a man who had realized he'd been living a ghost story. Min-ho sat by the fireplace, a glass of cognac in his hand. He didn't look up. You've caused quite a stir at the office, Hyun-Jae. The board is whispering about your American guests. It's messy. I warned you 10 years ago that woman was a complication we couldn't afford. Hyun-Jae walked to the center of the room. He didn't sit. You didn't warn me, Uncle. You scripted me. Min-ho paused, the glass halfway to his lips. I don't know what you're talking about. 2014. The MAC address spoofing, the offshore accounts, the forged fertility reports. Hyun-Jae's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. I used to think you were the guardian of our bloodline. Now I realize you're just a parasite that lived in the dark corners of my house. Min-ho set the glass down. His face didn't crumble, it hardened. I did what was necessary for the empire. You were soft. You were ready to give half your focus to a woman who had no place in our world. I saved H-Tech. No, Hyun-Jae said, holding up the tablet. You stole my life, and now I'm reclaiming the debt. You can't touch me, Min-ho sneered, reaching for his own phone. One press of a button, and the H-Tech server core initiates a self-destruct sequence. I built the back doors. If I go down, the empire goes with me. Min-ho tapped the screen. He tapped it again. He frowned, his thumb frantic. What is this? It's called a digital graveyard, a voice said from the doorway. Silas stood there, hands in his hoodie pockets. He looked remarkably small in the cavernous room, yet he held the entire room's energy. I didn't just close your back doors, great uncle. I rewrote the history of your access. As of 3 minutes ago, Park Min-ho doesn't exist in the H-Tech system. Your biometric scans, deleted. Your stock options, reverted to the corporate treasury due to a logic error you wrote yourself 10 years ago. Even your bank accounts are currently being flagged by the IMF for the very fraud you pinned on my mom. Min-ho's face went ash gray. He looked at his phone. The screen was black, save for a single, small icon. A white hibiscus flower, identical to the one he had sent Tasha, now slowly turning to dust. You're a monster, Min-ho whispered, looking at the boy. No, Silas said, his eyes as cold as the Seoul winter. I'm a Park. I'm just better at it than you. Hyun-Jae stepped closer to his uncle, his shadow looming over the old man. Get out! Don't take the clothes. Don't take the car. The security team outside isn't yours anymore. They've been instructed to escort a trespasser off the property. As Min-ho was led out, stumbling and broken, the silence that followed was heavier than the noise of the confrontation. Later that night, Hyun-Jae stood in the center of his penthouse. The war was over. His uncle was ruined. The board was cowed. The empire was secure, more profitable than ever thanks to the SS patch. He looked out at the city, expecting to feel the rush of victory. Instead, he felt a hollow ache in his chest that no amount of equity could fill. The door to the guest suite opened. Tasha stood there, her suitcase packed. Silas was behind her, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "The flight is at dawn," Tasha said quietly. Hyun-Jae turned, his heart sinking. "Tasha, stay. The estate is empty now. Minho is gone. There are no more lies between us. I can give you everything. I can make you the co-chair. I can build a school for Silas that—" "You're still talking about giving, Hyun-Jae," Tasha interrupted. She walked toward him, not as a subordinate or a victim, but as an equal. "You won the empire. Congratulations. It's a very shiny, very expensive cage, but Silas and I don't live in cages." "I love you," Hyun-Jae rasped. The words felt foreign in his mouth, rusty from disuse. Tasha looked at him, and for a fleeting second, he saw the girl she had been 30 years ago, the one who had loved him before the money became his skin. She reached out and touched his cheek, a gesture of profound tenderness that felt like a goodbye. "I know you do," she whispered, "but you've spent 10 years learning how to be a king. You've forgotten how to be a man. You think because the villains are gone, the hero gets the prize. But I'm not a prize, Hyun-Jae. I'm a woman who has spent 10 years being her own hero." She stepped back. "Silas needs to go home. He has a robotics competition in Virginia, and he promised his friend he'd help him with his math homework. He has a life, and so do I." "When will I see you?" Hyun-Jae asked, his voice cracking. Tasha paused at the door. "When you stop trying to have us and start trying to earn us. Until then, you have your empire. I hope it keeps you warm." The door clicked shut. Hyun-Jae stood alone in his $1 trillion penthouse. He looked at the vast, glittering expanse of Seoul below him. He was the most powerful man in the world, and he had never been more bankrupt in his life. He picked up his phone. He didn't call the board. He didn't call his lawyers. "Cancel my meetings for the next month," he told his assistant, "and find me a house. Not a penthouse, not a villa, a house in Great Falls, Virginia." The transition happened not with a bang, but with a series of signatures that shook the global markets. Park Hyun-Jae, the man who had been synonymous with the rise of H-Tech, signed the final deed of trust, handed his physical security token to a stunned board of trustees, and walked out of the glass tower with nothing but a single suitcase. 2 weeks later, the quiet tree-lined streets of Great Falls, Virginia, witnessed a strange sight. A small, shingled cottage sat directly across the cul-de-sac from Tasha Henry's home. It was a fixer-upper by Billionaire standards, possessing a porch that creaked and a lawn that needed edging. There were no black Escalades parked in the driveway. There was only a modest 5-year-old sedan and a man in a plain cotton shirt standing on the driveway, looking at a lawnmower as if it were a piece of alien technology. At precisely 6:55 a.m., the front door of Tasha's house opened. Silas stepped out, his backpack slumped over one shoulder, his eyes fixed on a handheld gaming device. He reached the edge of the driveway and stopped. Hyun-Jae was standing there, his silver hair ruffled by the morning breeze. He wasn't wearing a $10,000 suit. He was wearing a navy windbreaker and jeans that looked uncomfortably new. "Good morning, Silas," Hyun-Jae said. His voice was steady, but there was a tentative quality to it, like a man stepping onto thin ice. Silas looked up, his dark eyes scanning his father. He didn't look impressed, but he didn't look angry either. He looked at the man the way he looked at a line of code that wasn't quite working yet. "You're still here," the boy observed. "I live here now," Hyun-Jae replied, gesturing to the cottage behind him. I thought I might walk with you to the bus stop. It's a long walk with that pack." Silas shrugged. "It's 3 blocks. I've done it 500 times. 501 is a good number to start a change, Hyun-Jae said. Inside the house, Tasha stood behind the sheer linen curtains of the living room. She held a steaming mug of tea, her fingers curled tightly around the ceramic. She watched the two of them, the titan of industry and the boy who was his mirror image, begin the slow trek down the sidewalk. She saw Hyun-Jae reach out to take the backpack, only for Silas to pull away with a sharp, corrective shake of the head. She saw Hyun-Jae say something, likely a question about school, and Silas respond with a short, clipped answer. Hyun-Jae looked out of place. He walked with the rigid gait of a man used to marble floors, not cracked suburban asphalt. He looked smaller than he had in Seoul, older, more human. "You think a 3-block walk makes up for 10 years, Hyun-Jae?" she whispered to the empty room. She didn't smile. She didn't feel a rush of triumph. She felt a cold, analytical resolve. He had destroyed their world once for his throne. She wasn't about to let him into her world just because he had decided to sit on the floor. At the bus stop, the yellow bus screeched to a halt. Silas climbed the stairs without looking back. Hyun-Jae stood on the curb, his hands in his pockets, watching the bus until its tail lights disappeared around the corner. He stayed there for a full minute in the morning silence, a man who owned a $1 trillion legacy but was currently the least important person on that street. When he finally turned to walk back, he looked up at Tasha's window. Their eyes met for a fleeting second. Tasha didn't wave. She didn't nod. She simply let the curtain fall closed, the fabric a soft but absolute barrier between them. Hyun-Jae didn't flinch. He walked back to his small, quiet cottage, picked up a pair of gardening shears he had bought at the local hardware store, and began to work on the overgrown hedge. He was a man who had mastered the world's most complex algorithms. He could learn how to prune a bush. He could learn how to wait. The smell of scorched butter and desperation hung heavy in the air of the small cottage. On the stove sat a blackened pan containing the remains of what was supposed to be a fine herbs omelet. The light, fluffy French style Tasha used to crave on Sunday mornings in Seoul. Park Hyun-Jae, a man who had once negotiated trade treaties over Wagyu beef, stared at the rubbery, charred mess with a look of profound defeat. His knuckles were dusted with flour, and a smudge of egg yolk stained his plain apron. "The temperature gradient is nonlinear," he muttered to himself, his brow furrowed as if he were debugging a server crash. The copper core retains heat too efficiently for the protein structure. "It's not a physics problem, Hyun-Jae. You just had the flame too high." He spun around. Tasha stood in his open doorway, holding a basket of laundry. She looked at the smoke, then at him. The sight was almost absurd. The Sun King of Korea, a man whose time was once valued at $10,000 a minute, defeated by a $6 carton of eggs. "I wanted to bring it over," he said, his shoulders slumping. "I remember you liked it with chives. Fresh ones." "I did," she said, her voice neutral. She stepped into the kitchen and turned off his stove. 10 years ago. My tastes have changed. I prefer my eggs scrambled now. It's harder to mess up when life is busy." She didn't offer to help. She sat at his small laminate kitchen table, a far cry from the hand-carved mahogany of the Park estate. "I saw you at the local library yesterday. The branch manager said you applied for a position in the IT department." Hyun-Jae wiped his hands on a towel. "I start Monday, part-time, troubleshooting the public kiosks and helping the seniors with their tablets. It pays $15 an hour." "You're overqualified," she said, a hint of irony in her voice. "I'm exactly where I need to be," he replied, sitting across from her. "I spent my life building systems that no one could touch. I think I'd like to spend a little time fixing things that people actually use." He looked at her, the golden afternoon light catching the silver in her hair. "Tell me about the years I missed, Tasha. Not the SS patch, not the genius. Tell me about the days when the car wouldn't start, or when Silas had a fever. Tell me about the parts of your life that didn't require a trillionaire." Tasha leaned back, her gaze moving to the window. She didn't look at him with the bitterness of a victim. She looked at him with the serenity of a victor. The first year was the hardest, she began, not because I was poor. I had my savings, but because I had to learn to be two people at once. I remember the night Silas was born. There was a thunderstorm in Richmond. I drove myself to the hospital. I sat in the parking lot between contractions, timing them on my watch, and I realized I'm the only person in the world who knows this boy is coming. And in that moment, I felt more powerful than you ever did in your boardroom. Hyun-Jae flinched, but he didn't interrupt. I didn't spend those years pining for you, she continued, her voice steady. I spent them building a firm from a laptop in a nursery. I spent them teaching Silas that his brain was a gift, but his heart was a choice. When he got his first A in a subject he hated just to prove he could do it, I was the one who cheered. When he cried because he realized he was different from the other kids, I was the one who told him that different is where the future lives. She looked directly at Hyun-Jae, her eyes clear. I didn't survive you, Hyun-Jae. I flourished without you. I wasn't waiting for a rescue. I was busy being the hero of my own story. Silas doesn't need a father to complete his life. He has a mother who made sure his life was already full. Hyun-Jae reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of hers. The silence was heavy with the weight of the decade he had thrown away. He realized that his sacrifice for the company hadn't been a noble burden. It had been a pathetic trade. He had traded the chance to be a hero in the real world for the chance to be a god in a digital one. I didn't come here to rescue you, he whispered, his voice thick with a sudden, sharp clarity. I think I came here so you could rescue me. Tasha stood up, picking up her laundry basket. She didn't give him the absolution he craved, but she didn't shut the door on it either. The library opens at 9, Hyun-Jae, she said. Don't be late. It's a regular job. People depend on you. As she walked out, she glanced at the burnt omelet in the pan and scraped the pan before the carbon sets. It's harder to clean if you let it sit. Hyun-Jae watched her cross the street. He didn't feel like a chairman. He felt like a man who had just received his first real lesson in 10 years. He picked up the spatula and began to scrape. The autumn air in Virginia had turned sharp, and for a man who had spent 30 years in climate-controlled offices and heated limousines, the transition was a physical tax he hadn't accounted for. Hyun-Jae didn't collapse in a dramatic heap. It was a slow, grinding fatigue. After 3 weeks of walking Silas to the bus, working 8-hour shifts at the library, and spending his evenings unsuccessfully trying to master the mechanics of a suburban lawn, the 65-year-old's body simply checked out. It was a common flu, exacerbated by the bone-deep exhaustion of a man trying to outrun his own shadow. Across the street, Tasha noticed the absence first. At 7 a.m., the sidewalk remained empty. At 9 a.m., the small sedan in the cottage driveway hadn't moved. By 6 p.m., no lights had flickered on in the kitchen across the way. He wasn't at the bus stop, Mom, Silas said, looking up from his homework, and he didn't show up at the library. The manager called here asking if I knew where he was. Tasha sighed, a sound of weary resignation. She went to the kitchen, ladled a bowl of the chicken and ginger soup she'd made for dinner into a thermos, and grabbed a spare key Hyun-Jae had left under a loose stone on his porch, a gesture she had ignored until now. When she entered the cottage, it smelled of menthol and cold air. She found him in the bedroom, buried under 3 layers of blankets, his face flushed with a fever that made him look his full age. Hyun-Jae, she said, placing a hand on his forehead. He was burning up. He opened his eyes, squinting through the haze. Tasha, I missed the bus. Silas, is he home? He's fine. He's doing calculus. Drink this. She sat on the edge of the bed and helped him sit up, guiding the thermos to his lips. He drank the soup greedily, the warmth seeming to ground him. As the fever began to sweat out, The sharp, defensive edges of his personality softened. For the first time, he didn't look like a chairman or a penitent sinner. He just looked like a man. "I'm not as strong as I was in Seoul," he whispered, leaning back against the headboard. "I thought I could just force my way into this life, like a hostile takeover." "You can't automate a life, Hyun-Jae," Tasha said softly. She looked around the small room. On his bedside table, there weren't any financial reports or tablets. There was a stack of paperbacks, old, worn things with broken spines. She picked one up. The Count of Monte Cristo. "I remember this," she said, a small smile touching her lips. "You read this to me when we were in Jeju. You said it was the greatest story of justice ever told." Hyun-Jae let out a weak, raspy laugh. "I used to think so. I like the part where he gets the gold and the revenge, but reading it again, in this house, I realized I was reading it wrong." "Oh?" "The ending," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "He realizes that all the gold in the world couldn't give him back the years he spent in the dark. He ends up with nothing but a small boat and the woman who stayed. I used to think the treasure was the point. Now I realize the treasure was the distraction." Tasha opened a book with a dog-eared page. "I always preferred Persuasion," she said. "Anne Elliot, the woman who waited, not out of hope, but out of a sense of self. She didn't need Captain Wentworth to return to be happy. She was already whole. When he came back, it wasn't a rescue, it was an addition." "I was never a captain," Hyun-Jae murmured. "I was just a man who forgot how to read anything that didn't have a $sign attached to it." They sat in silence for a long time. Not the tense, loaded silence of the boardroom or the bitter silence of the divorce, but a quiet literary peace. They talked about the books they had read in the decade apart. She spoke of the poetry that sustained her during the lonely nights in Richmond. He spoke of the philosophy he had begun to consume at the Great Falls Library between fixing printer jams. There was no mention of H-Tech, no mention of the board, or the trillions, or the uncle. "Tasha," he said as she rose to leave, "I don't want to be the Count anymore. I don't want the revenge or the gold." Tasha paused at the door, the thermos in her hand. "Then keep reading, Hyun-Jae. You're only on chapter 15. There's a lot of book left." She didn't stay the night. She didn't kiss him. But as she walked back across the street, she didn't close the curtains. She left them open so she could see the light in his window. The H-Tech 30th Anniversary Gala was the most coveted ticket in the Eastern Hemisphere. The grand ballroom of the Shilla Hotel was a sea of black ties, diamond rivieres, and the soft, predatory hum of the world's most powerful people. To the press, this wasn't just a party, it was a coronation. The rumor mill had reached a fever pitch. The exiled queen had returned, the ghost heir was in the building, and the chairman was expected to solidify the empire with a grand romantic gesture that would unite H-Tech and the Henry Consultancy forever. Hyun-Jae stood near the stage, looking every bit the Trillionaire patriarch in a midnight blue tuxedo. But his eyes weren't on the teleprompter. They were on the balcony. Tasha stood there, silhouetted against the Seoul skyline. At 65, she was breathtaking. She wore a gown of structured silver silk that moved like mercury. Her white hair swept back in a defiant, elegant wave. She didn't look like a woman being reclaimed. She looked like the moon, cool, distant, and entirely responsible for her own orbit. Hyun-Jae climbed the stairs to join her, leaving the expectant crowd below. He held a small velvet box in his hand. Not a contract, but a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, the only woman in his family who had ever married for love. "The board is waiting," Hyun-Jae said, his voice soft. "They have the press release ready. The return of the Park family. They think a wedding is the only way to protect the stock price. They think it's the only way to keep us together." Tasha turned to him. The city lights reflected in her eyes, but she didn't look at the ring. She looked at the man. They think in terms of mergers and acquisitions, Hyun-Jae, she said. They think a signature on a piece of paper makes a home. But I've spent 10 years being my own foundation. I didn't raise Silas to be a park. I raised him to be a human being. I know, Hyun-Jae said, closing the box. He didn't look disappointed. He looked relieved. I realized something in that little cottage in Virginia. I don't want a merger. I don't want to own the legacy. Then what do you want? I want to know if the man who works at the library has a chance with the woman who likes persuasion. Tasha smiled, a real warm smile that reached her eyes. She reached out and straightened his lapel, her fingers lingering for just a second. I'm not signing a marriage contract, Hyun-Jae. I'm not becoming a park asset to soothe your shareholders. My life is in Virginia. My firm is in Virginia. My freedom is everywhere. She stepped closer, her voice a gentle command. But I'll go to dinner with you the day after tomorrow, in Great Falls, at that little Italian place by the library, if you're on time, and if you don't bring a single bodyguard. Hyun-Jae let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for a decade. I'll be 10 minutes early. No, she teased, turning back to the view. Be exactly on time. I've waited long enough for you. I don't want you rushing the journey now. A few days later, the setting sun turned the Atlantic horizon into a bruised purple and gold. The beach in Virginia was deserted, save for 3 figures walking along the tide line. Silas was in the middle, his trousers rolled up to his knees, gesturing wildly with a piece of driftwood as he drew equations in the damp sand. See, if you observe the particle, you change its state, Silas was saying, his voice bright with the fervor of a genius in his element. But in a multi-world interpretation, the version of us that didn't go to Seoul still exists. They're just in a different string. But this string, this one is the most stable because the variables finally aligned. Hyun-Jae walked to his left, carrying Silas's discarded sneakers. He was listening with an intensity he used to reserve for billion-dollar pitches. He understood the music of it. He understood that he was being allowed to listen. Tasha walked to the right, a few paces ahead, leading the way. Her footsteps were light in the sand. She didn't look back to see if they were following. She knew they were, the trillionaire and the genius, the past and the future. She stopped and looked out at the ocean, the wind whipping her silver hair. She felt the weight of the last 10 years, the struggle, the silence, the victory. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There was no palace, no crown, and no sudden erasure of the lost decade. But as Hyun-Jae caught up to her and Silas started explaining the entanglement of photons, Tasha felt the warmth of the sun on her face. She had earned this. She had built this. She took a step forward into the water, and the 2 men followed her into the surf. 3 lives finally operating on the same frequency. The end. Thank you for watching. If you love this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional twists and character-driven plots. And if you're ready for the next story, make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Until next time, keep believing in love that defies all odds.